So I want you to take a second and just kind of mentally deconstruct your favorite piece of modern electronic or, loop-based music.
Yeah, just really picture it.
Right, like maybe it's a really dense, sample-heavy hip-hop track that's built around this massive hypnotic drum break. Or maybe it's this driving, relentless techno anthem that basically locks a whole warehouse full of people into a collective trance at like 3 in the morning.
Or honestly, even just a super hyper-produced piece of modern pop on your daily Spotify playlist.
Exactly. Whatever it is, you probably, and logically, I mean, you view it as a product of the digital age. Like, it exists because of laptops,
Like,
right? And digital audio workstations, MIDI grids, software algorithms.
that's the assumption we all make.
But, so here is the major revelation we are unpacking today. The structural DNA for almost all of those genres, like the absolute foundational architecture of how that music operates, was fundamentally engineered decades before any of that digital technology even existed.
Which is just wild to think about.
It really is. It was actually engineered in this reverberating converted movie theater in late 1960s West Germany, and it was done by this experimental collective who essentially they viewed traditional rock music as a dead language.
And I think it's genuinely one of the most radical evolutionary leaps in the history of recorded sound.
Yeah.
We have this tendency, especially now, to look at the evolution of music as a super clean, linear progression of technology.
Right, like step A to step B.
Exactly. We think it goes from acoustic instruments to electric amplification, then to analog synths, and finally to, digital software. But history is rarely ever that clean.
No, it's usually super messy.
Yeah. What we're looking at today is this massive, sudden mutation. It's a moment where a specific group of individuals looked at the accepted rules of their era, just tossed all of them out, and basically brute forced the digital future into existence. And they did it using razor blades, magnetic tape, and just sheer physical endurance.
And that is exactly our mission for this deep dive. So welcome. Today, we're taking a really fascinating, comprehensive retrospective that was published by Monumental Movement Records, MMR, about the 1970s experimental West German group known as Can.
And we're going to use it to basically deconstruct how music itself is made.
Right, because we aren't just going to sit here and talk about the biography of a band. We're going to look at the actual acoustic physics of how they completely dismantled the traditional rock grammar of the US and the UK.
They completely abandoned verse-chorus structures.
Totally. They abandoned blues scales. They replaced that entire framework with this radical new architecture that was built on extreme repetition, the integration of pure chants, and this really obsessive surgical tape editing process.
To really grasp the magnitude of this, you have to fundamentally rethink your definition of what a song actually is.
Yeah.
And more importantly, what the act of recording is even meant to achieve.
Which is a big shift.
It is. Because for most of the 20th century, a recording was basically a documentary medium. You put a band in a room, you throw some microphones in front of them, and you try to capture a live performance as accurately as possible.
Just taking a photograph of the sound.
Yes, exactly. But Can upended that completely. They didn't just write music differently. They changed the entire definition of the medium. They used the studio not to capture reality, but to synthesize a totally new one.
Let's ground this in a structural analogy right away, just so we're all on the same page. Think about standard pop or rock music, even the really sophisticated stuff from the late 1960s. It's like building a house from a highly detailed architectural blueprint.
Right, where the songwriter is the architect.
Exactly. Everything is meticulously calculated in advance. You know exactly where the foundation goes. You know where the load-bearing walls are, where the plumbing runs. You gather the materials, you execute the blueprint, and boom, you get the house. That's the song.
But Can's approach was entirely different from that.
Entirely. They were more like, metallurgical engineers who just decided that existing blueprints were completely obsolete. So instead, they build this massive furnace out in a field. They smelt down raw sonic elements, so guitars, drums, random radio static. They pour all that molten noise out into the natural landscape, and then only after it cools, they take heavy machinery to carve out a structure from the resulting chaos.
They weren't building songs, they were discovering them hidden in the raw material.
Exactly. It's such a completely different mindset.
It really is. The transition from the blueprint to the raw material is the perfect way to frame this. But, to understand why these highly trained, brilliant musicians felt the need to abandon the blueprint in the first place, we have to look really closely at the soil they were standing on.
The cultural context.
Yeah, we have to examine the socio-political and, honestly, the psychological reality of West Germany in 1968. The MMR retrospective outlines this perfectly. Post-war Germany was, for the youth of that era, just an absolute cultural void.
Right. So let's put ourselves in the shoes of like a 20-something coming of age in West Germany in the late 1960s. You are living in the direct, suffocating shadow of the Second World War.
The trauma is everywhere.
Everywhere. And the entire cultural identity of your parents' generation, their literature, their classical music, their folk traditions, it all feels entirely tainted by fascism and the Holocaust.
Yeah, there is this overwhelming psychological concept in Germany at the time called Vergangenheitsbewältigung.
I'm not even going to try to pronounce that.
Yeah, it roughly translates to the struggle of coming to terms with the past, and it meant you couldn't look backwards for artistic inspiration because the past was literally radioactive.
It was a paralyzed culture.
Hmm?
The traditional German cultural identity had been hijacked, weaponized, and ultimately destroyed by the Nazis. So for this new generation, like the generation of the 1968 student protests, a generation that's dealing with immense political radicalization looking backward was morally and artistically impossible.
They literally called it Stundennull, or Year Zero, like everything had to be rebuilt from scratch.
But the immediate alternative they were given wasn't much better, right? Because West Germany was occupied by Allied forces, which meant the radio waves were entirely dominated by the American Forces Network and British broadcasting.
So that cultural vacuum was just being aggressively filled by imported Anglo-American pop and rock.
Yeah.
You know, the Beatles, the Rolling Stones, Chuck Berry, basically the blues.
All of which is phenomenal music, obviously. But if you are a young German artist looking for your own identity, playing 12-bar blues just feels like you're adopting the uniform of your occupying force. It's not yours.
Exactly. It felt like trading one form of cultural erasure for another.
Yeah.
You really have to remember that American rock and roll is fundamentally based on the blues, which is deeply rooted in this specific, localized African-American experience.
Right.
So for a group of middle-class German kids in Cologne to sit around and sing the blues, it felt inherently inauthentic to them. It was like pantomime. They were desperate to escape this imitation.
They needed a sound that was severed from both the toxic German past and the imported American present.
And that urgent, almost aggressive desire to forge a completely unprecedented musical identity is the foundational catalyst for what the British music press would later dub krautrock.
So, into this super intense, highly politicized cultural vacuum step are core architects of Can, Ermin Schmidt, and Holger Suke. And we need to look at their pedigrees for a second, because these were not guys who just picked up guitars to meet girls or emulate Mick Jagger.
Not at all. They were rigorous, highly trained academics.
Yeah, they had both actually studied under Karl-Heinz Stockhausen, and we cannot gloss over Stockhausen here. He is basically the skeleton key to understanding Can's entire operating system.
The Stockhausen is a monumental figure. He was one of the most polarizing and honestly most influential composers of 20th century avant-garde music. He was a pioneer of music concrete and early electronic music.
He wasn't exactly sitting at a piano writing pleasant little pop melodies.
Oh no. He was working in literal laboratories, physically manipulating magnetic tape, splicing together sine waves generated by early oscillators, and using complex mathematics and acoustic physics to generate sound.
Wow.
Yeah. And he taught his students that music was not an exercise in emotional narrative. It was an exercise in acoustic engineering. It was all about organizing frequencies in space and time.
Structure and time. It's a completely clinical, objective way to look at sound. If you are trained by Stockhausen, you don't look at a piece of magnetic tape and think, oh, this is where the chorus goes.
No, you look at a piece of magnetic tape and realize that 15 inches of that tape equals exactly 1 second of time. You realize that music is literally just physical space moving across a playback head.
That physical relationship to time is so crucial. Stockhausen taught Schmidt and Chouquet that any sound like a slamming door, some radio static, a dog barking, could be musical if it was organized mathematically.
So Schmidt and Chouquet take this super high-minded, fiercely avant-garde academic philosophy, but they decide they want to apply it to a contemporary rhythmic format.
They didn't want to make sterile academic music for concert halls. They wanted to make visceral music.
Exactly. So they recruit Michael Caroli, who was a younger, self-taught guitarist. He brought this really raw, jagged rock energy, and then they brought in Jaki Liebezeit, a drummer who had spent years playing highly complex, fluid free jazz.
It is an incredibly volatile mixture of backgrounds. You've got Stockhausen's cold academic structuralism colliding with Caroli's rock and roll electricity and Liebezeit's jazz chops.
But the unified mandate, the one rule that bound them all together, was that they outright refused to be a band in the traditional sense.
Right. They weren't interested in writing songs to perform on a stage. The retrospective highlights that they viewed themselves as an experimental device. Their goal was to create situations that generated sound rather than writing compositions to be played.
It was an active rejection of the ego that drives traditional rock music. In a standard band, the song is a vehicle for personal expression,
Right, the singer is telling you a story about their heartbreak.
and the guitarist is playing a blistering solo to show off their technical prowess. It's all, look at me, listen to my feelings.
Yes, pay attention to my emotion.
Exactly. But heavily informed by that avant-garde background, they stripped the music of its narrative ego. They treated the band format as a closed-circuit laboratory experiment. When they plugged in their instruments, they weren't trying to express human emotion.
They were injecting acoustic variables into a space and passively observing how those variables interacted.
Right. How they collided, how they established a groove, and how they decayed.
But, okay, if your goal is to capture highly volatile, spontaneous acoustic situations, you can't exactly just rent out a standard commercial studio like Abbey Road for a 3-hour block on a Tuesday.
No, commercial studios are super expensive, and you are on the clock.
Yeah.
You can't truly experiment if you are paying by the hour.
Right. You need a dedicated, permanent space where the experiment can just run 24 hours a day. You need a laboratory. And for
Yeah.
Can, that laboratory became absolutely legendary. They called it Inner Space.
The physical environment of inner space is arguably the most important member of the band. Initially, they set up in a 14th century castle.
Wait, a literal 14th century castle?
Yes, a castle called Schloss Nürnberg, which is wild enough on its own. But eventually they moved into a space in Weilerswist near Cologne, which was a converted former movie theater. And the acoustics of a cinema are entirely different from a standard recording studio.
Let's really unpack the acoustics of that, because modern recording studios in the 60s and 70s, especially in places like Los Angeles, were heavily soundproofed. They used baffles, carpets, acoustic foam to deaden the room completely.
The whole goal was to isolate every instrument so the drums didn't bleed into the guitar microphone, giving the producer total control to mix it later.
Exactly. But a cinema is designed for the exact opposite purpose. It is designed to take sound from the screen and throw it outward into this massive, cavernous space. It's built for natural reverberation and echo.
A cinema has massive standing waves and really long decay times. And Can didn't try to suppress that room sound at all. They weaponized it. They didn't put the drummer in an isolated booth. They set up right in the main room.
The spatiality and the natural reverberations of that converted theater weren't just passively recorded, they became active, vital frequencies in the music itself. The studio was their primary instrument.
They were playing the acoustic reflections of the room just as much as they were playing the strings on a guitar. The bleed, the sound of the snare drum leaking into the vocal microphone wasn't a mistake. It was the glue that held the entire sonic picture together.
So what did the actual day-to-day methodology look like inside this echoing theater? Because it sounds simultaneously exhausting and entirely liberating.
Well, they would essentially just arm the 2-track magnetic tape machines, hit record, and play. They would engage in hours upon hours of pure, unadulterated improvisational jams.
But we really have to make a very sharp distinction here between Can and a traditional jam band. Like, in rock or jazz, the improvisation is the final product. You listen to a jazz record, and you are hearing exactly what happened in the room in that specific 10-minute window.
Right. But for Can, those sprawling, hours-long jams were not the music. They were merely the gathering of raw acoustic data.
The actual composition of the music, the structure, the form, the dynamics, none of that happened while they were holding their instruments. It happened afterward in the editing room.
And this brings us to the domain of Holger Suquet. He was the bass player, but honestly, more importantly, he was the chief engineer, the archivist, and the editor.
And we really need to emphasize the physical reality of what editing meant in 1970. Today, you look at a digital audio workstation like Pro Tools or Ableton. You see the sound visually represented on a screen as a waveform.
If you want to cut a drum beat, you highlight it with a mouse, hit cut, and hit paste.
Right. And if you make a mistake, you just hit undo. It takes 3 seconds. But Holger Suquet was working with physical 2-track magnetic tape.
The physics of analog tape editing are just punishing. The tape is running at 15 inches per second. So Suquet had to take these massive reels of tape that contained hours of chaotic jamming and listen through them with this incredibly forensic attention to detail.
And when he found, say, a 10-second groove that was magical, He had to physically mark the tape with a grease pencil right over the playback head.
Yeah, he had to manually rock the reels back and forth just to hear the exact transient like the very beginning of a snare drum hit market, place the tape in an aluminum splicing block, take a literal razor blade, and cut the tape at a precise 45-degree angle.
The 45-degree angle is so it wouldn't create an audio pop as it passed over the head, right?
Exactly. And then he had to physically tape it to another piece of magnetic tape using adhesive.
It is intensely physical, painstaking, almost microscopic labor. Imagine trying to edit an hour of chaotic improvisational noise down to a tight 5-minute pop song using nothing but a razor blade and scotch tape.
This methodology completely elevates the role of the editor to the exact same level as the instrumentalist. The tape machine was the true composer of Can's music.
The hours of jamming were just the raw block of marble. Chukay's razor blade was the chisel that revealed the sculpture hidden inside.
And the crazy thing is, Jaki didn't even limit his raw materials to the instruments in the room. He was completely fascinated by shortwave radios.
Oh, right. The shortwave stuff is incredible.
Because a shortwave radio can pick up signals from across the planet by bouncing frequencies off the ionosphere. Jaki would just sit in the studio with a receiver, capturing random bursts of static, Morse code, foreign news broadcasts, strange atmospheric anomalies.
And he would collage these external noises directly onto the tape alongside the band. He firmly believed that if a random radio broadcast bled into the frequency range of the track, it was a legitimate structural part of the music. Which is mind-blowing because that is a direct operational precursor to modern sampling culture. Long before hip-hop producers in the Bronx were lifting drum breaks from James Brown records, Holger Suke was literally lifting the atmospheric noise of the planet and injecting it into a rock rhythm section.
They were even known to record their live, public performances, bring the tapes back to inner space, and splice the live recordings directly into the studio recordings.
They completely blurred the line between the reality of a live performance and the artificiality of a studio production.
They understood, long before most people did, that a record does not have to be an authentic document of a specific moment in time. A record is an artificial construct. You can use the studio to build a sonic environment that could never actually exist in reality.
Okay, but I have to interject here because anyone who has ever suffered through a really self-indulgent jam band knows that hours of improvisation usually results in just unlistenable, aimless noodling.
Oh, absolutely.
It's usually music where the musicians are having significantly more fun playing it than the audience is having listening to it. If Can was just generating hours of spontaneous noise, how did it not devolve into an impenetrable mess?
That is the crucial variable. The difference between aimless noodling and avant-garde mastery is ruthless curation. If Can had simply released the unedited 4-hour jams, it might well have been a chore to listen to.
Right.
But they applied a brutal, deeply critical editorial lens to their own work. They had the discipline to throw away 95% of what they played and only keep the 5% that achieved absolute liftoff.
They didn't fall in love with their own playing. Like a guitarist in a normal band might say, you can't cut my solo. But in Can, if the solo didn't serve the structural integrity of the tape edit, Jukay's razor blade severed it without hesitation.
But wait, there's a massive mechanical problem here that we have to address.
Right, the tempo issue.
Yes. If Jukay is meticulously cutting tape, he needs a completely flawless mathematical grid to cut on. If you are splicing a drum beat from minute 15 of a jam together with a drum beat from minute 45, the tempo has to be identical.
Because if the drummer is speeding up because he's excited or slowing down because he's tired, those tape splices will drift out of time. They will sound incredibly clunky and disjointed. You can't execute this kind of razor blade surgery with a standard rock drummer.
No, you need a human metronome.
And that necessity brings us to the beating heart of Can's entire architecture. The drummer, Jaki Liebezeit. His philosophy is perhaps the most defining characteristic of the entire krautrock sound.
Liebezeit's background is so fascinating because he came from the world of free jazz, which is a genre that is entirely about fluidity. It's about swinging around the beat, constantly shifting time signatures.
But when he joined Can, he adopted a philosophy that sounds almost anti-human. A fellow musician once supposedly told him, "You must play monotonous." And he took that entirely to heart. He believed in what the retrospective describes as not playing emotionally.
That phrase, not playing emotionally, is everything. Think about how a traditional rock drummer operates. The drummer uses the kit to actively manipulate the listener's emotions.
Right. They play quietly during the verse, they build tension with a snare roll, they smash the crash cymbal right as the chorus hits to give you that sense of explosive release.
They use drum fills to signal a transition. The drummer is essentially acting as a theatrical director, telling the audience exactly when to feel excitement or tension.
It's highly theatrical, and it constantly resets the listener's internal clock.
Liebezeit completely rejected that theater. He realized that emotional drum fills interrupt the structural flow of the music. So he developed this relentlessly driving, machine-like style that became universally known as the motoric beat, which literally translates to motor skill.
It is an incredibly propulsive, flat 44 rhythm. Just kick, snare, kick, kick, snare. It does not speed up. It does not slow down. And crucially, it almost entirely eliminates the use of crash cymbals and complex drum fills.
The mythology surrounding his endurance is just incredible. He could allegedly hold a single complex beat for an hour without wavering a fraction of a millisecond.
Wow, that's insane.
And the rhythm was so violently fixed that the other band members, Caroli on guitar or Schmidt on keyboards, would frequently get completely lost during their wild improvisations. They would wander so far into avant-garde noise that they would lose the downbeat of the measure.
In a standard band, the drummer would throw in a little fill or strike a cymbal to act as a beacon, helping the band find their place.
But Liebezeit refused. He would never alter the machinery to save them. He just kept the piston firing endlessly until they found their own way back to the groove.
He was the fixed axis. If we look at the structural model of Can's music, it functions like an equation. The foundation is motoric beat, which provides absolute, uncompromising stability and fixed time.
Right. And on top of that foundation, you have the improvisational layer. The guitars, the keyboards, the shortwave radios, which provide constant mutation, noise, and change.
And then finally, you have the tape editing, which organizes that friction into a final composition. You have a constant generating of change over a completely stable flow of time.
It reminds me of setting the cruise control on your car during a really long road trip.
Oh, that's a great analogy.
Yeah, you set the engine at exactly 65 miles per hour on a dead straight highway. Because the forward momentum of the car is perfectly, effortlessly stable, the passengers inside are completely freed from the anxiety of driving.
They are allowed to absolutely trash the interior, crawl over the seats, hang out the windows, and just go completely wild.
Exactly. The absolute stability of the vehicle allows for the absolute chaos of the passengers. If the driver was constantly speeding up, slamming the brakes and swerving, everyone would just be holding on for dear life. Liebezeit's drumming was the cruise control that allowed the rest of the band to tear apart the interior.
The stability creates the safety for the avant-garde to exist without collapsing the song. And, there's a profound neurological aspect to this, too. When a rhythm removes all of those emotional markers, when it just drives forward relentlessly, repeating the exact same pattern without ever offering the release of a cymbal crash, it alters the listener's brainwaves.
It absolutely does. It forces the human brain into a trance state. It mimics the deep, ancient rhythms of a heartbeat, or of walking, or of industrial machinery.
It's deeply hypnotic. Because the groove never changes, your brain stops anticipating a transition. It surrenders to the rhythm.
And once the listener is locked into that trance, the guitars and tape loops can become incredibly dissonant or chaotic without alienating the listener. The groove anchors you while the textures explore the stratosphere.
So we have this incredible laboratory, the echoing cinema, the razor blade editing, the hypnotic, emotionless machinery of the drums. But if your rhythm is perfectly mechanized and your instruments are exploring acoustic physics, the traditional role of a lead singer becomes a massive liability.
Oh, completely.
You cannot have a guy standing at a microphone singing a literal narrative story about a breakup or a car crash over this kind of cosmic machinery. Literal language would instantly ground the music in mundane reality. They had to deconstruct the human voice just like they deconstructed the drums.
The concept of the frontman had to be dismantled. The vocalists in Can were never treated as storytellers or narrators. They were treated as pure sonic elements. Their voices were just another frequency in the room, no more or less important than the bass guitar or the shortwave radio.
Their first vocalist was an American sculptor named Malcolm Mooney. He just happened to be living in Germany at the time. And Mooney's style was aggressively repetitive.
He didn't sing melodies in a traditional sense. He would latch onto a single phrase and repeat it endlessly, locking in with Liebezeit's drums.
His voice was a device for generating extreme psychological tension and rhythmic friction. It wasn't about the meaning of the words, it was about the percussive attack of the syllables.
But acting as a human rhythmic engine takes a severe psychological toll. Mooney wasn't just singing, he was acting as a pressure valve for all of this intense avant-garde energy.
Yeah, the retrospective notes that the mental strain of this relentless hypnotic repetition eventually became too much, and Mooney had to return to the United States on the advice of a psychiatrist.
It was a massive blow to the band. But his departure sets up what is unequivocally one of the greatest, most serendipitous origin stories in the history of music.
It is the ultimate testament to their absolute devotion to chance. Okay, so the band is in Munich. They have a sold-out show scheduled for that very night, but they have no vocalist.
Schmidt and Liebezeit are sitting at an outdoor cafe, and they hear something strange across the street.
It's a young Japanese man, a traveler named Demo Suzuki, busking on the sidewalk. But he's not playing folk songs. He is screaming, whispering, and singing wildly.
They watch him for a few minutes walk across the street, and without any formal audition, invite this complete stranger to front their band on stage that exact same evening.
And incredibly, Suzuki agrees. With zero rehearsal time, zero knowledge of the band's material, and zero understanding of their complex avant-garde theories, he walks onto the stage in Munich and improvises the entire performance.
The chemistry was instantaneous. He walked off the stage as a permanent member of the band. This is the Stockhausen philosophy realized in real time.
They saw a chaotic, uncontrolled variable on the street, a busker, and they immediately injected him into their laboratory just to see how the acoustics would react.
And the reaction was alchemical. Suzuki's methodology was completely unprecedented. He didn't write lyrics in a notebook. He improvised entirely on the spot, creating this highly rhythmic, multilingual blend of English, Japanese, and completely fabricated, meaningless syllables.
He was singing pure gibberish, but doing it with absolute hypnotic conviction. Furthermore, he destroyed the physical barrier of the stage. He would frequently wander off the stage and roam through the audience while singing, physically blurring the line between the performer generating the art and the spectator consuming it.
But we have to ask a critical question here about the listener's experience. If a lead singer is literally speaking gibberish, intentionally stringing together nonsense syllables, what does the audience latch onto?
Right. How do we connect with a song if we don't understand what the singer is even saying?
It requires a complete rewiring the how we listen. We rely so heavily on lyrics to dictate our emotional response. A pop singer tells us, I am heartbroken, so our brain says, okay, this is a sad song. The lyrics are emotional instructions.
So if Demo Suzuki strips away all of those linguistic instructions, what are we actually listening to?
We're listening to the raw, unadulterated texture of the human voice. By stripping away semantics and grammar, Suzuki turned his vocal cords back into a pure acoustic instrument. He was essentially a fleshy wind instrument.
He intuitively understood that human speech is inherently rhythmic and melodic, even if you remove the meaning.
Exactly. It was entirely about the timbre, the phrasing, and the dynamic flow of the sound. Think about how you listen to a saxophone solo on a jazz record. You don't try to decipher what the saxophone is saying, literally. You don't look for a narrative.
You feel the emotion in the tone, whether the sax is weeping or screaming or whispering.
Suzuki forced the audience to listen to the human voice with that exact same abstract appreciation. The gibberish was a feature, not a bug. It freed the listener from the tyranny of narrative.
Okay, let's step back and look at the absolute absurdity of the toolkit they have assembled here. They are operating in an echoing, cavernous cinema. They have a drummer who plays like an emotionless industrial piston.
They have a bassist who composes the actual music after the fact by hacking apart magnetic tape with a razor blade.
They are piping in atmospheric static from a shortwave radio, and they are fronted by a street busker who sings multilingual nonsense.
On paper, this sounds like a pretentious art school disaster that should have been completely unlistenable to anyone outside of a university basement.
And yet, this exact configuration somehow resulted in a string of actual, tangible masterpieces that achieved real commercial success.
The speed of their evolution is staggering. The timeline provided in the retrospective shows a band that was mutating in real time. They formed in 1968, and over the next 5 years they produced a run of albums that essentially mapped out the future of alternative music.
The definitive breakthrough, the ultimate proof of concept for their laboratory, arrives in 1971 with the double album, Tago Mago.
Tago Mago is a terrifying and brilliant monolith. It is the absolute limit of what you can achieve with tape editing and improvisation.
The first half of the record features these incredibly tight, driving, almost funky grooves, driven by Liebezeit's motoric beat and Suzuki's rhythmic whispering. Tracks like Hallelujah are these towering 18-minute monuments of groove.
But the second half of the record descends into absolute acoustic madness.
Yeah, the second half of Tagamago is where the Stockhausen influence takes complete control. There is a track called Aman that essentially abandons rhythm entirely.
It is a terrifying soundscape built almost entirely from Suke's extreme tape manipulations. You had heavily echoed vocals, reversed tape loops, the screeching of early electronic oscillators, and literally the sound of howling dogs.
It completely abandons the framework of rock music and crosses over into pure avant-garde noise terror. It was a massive reconstruction of recorded fragments pieced together with an almost violent editorial hand.
Tagomago blew the doors off the laboratory. It proved that you could stretch a rock band into the shape of a symphony or a nightmare. But what is truly fascinating is that instead of repeating that formula, they immediately pivoted.
Right. The following year, in 1972, they released Edge Bamyasi.
Jade Bumyasi is a masterclass in tension and restraint. Having proved they could create 18-minute chaotic epics, they decided to apply their razor blade methodology to more condensed, tightly wound structures.
The music becomes remarkably funky, incredibly sharp, and highly rhythmic. And it's on this album that we find one of the greatest ironies in 20th century music, the track Spoon.
Spoon is incredible. Here is this deeply experimental anti-commercial collective. For Spoon, they use an early primitive drum machine, a Roland Rhythm 77, and blend it perfectly with Liebezeit's acoustic drum kit.
It's an incredibly sophisticated, propulsive track with Suzuki whispering over the top, and somehow this avant-garde experiment was selected to be the theme song for a mainstream, highly popular German television crime thriller called Das Messer, which means the knife.
It's a stunning moment of cultural infiltration. This underground, purely experimental unit suddenly had a massive top 10 commercial hit in Germany.
It proved that their bizarre, laboratory-born methods could actually generate legitimate, infectious pop culture phenomena. They didn't compromise their avant-garde principles to write a hit. The hit was a natural byproduct of their acoustic experiments.
But once again, they refused to stay in the lane they had created. By 1973, they released Future Days, and the sonic landscape shifts entirely again.
The aggressive, razor-sharp funk of Age Bamyasi dissolves into something much more fluid. The drums become lighter, almost bossa nova influenced.
They introduce complex environmental sounds, shimmering keyboard washes, and incredibly long, sustained tones. The 20-minute track, Bel Air, is a masterpiece of shifting oceanic atmospheres.
Future Days is widely recognized as a direct foundational text for the entire genre of ambient music.
The evolution from Tagamago to Future Days in just 2 years is remarkable. But there is a specific detail about the recording of Future Days that reveals how deeply their process had matured.
Oh, this is the part about them not talking, right?
Yes. By 1973, the band members were so profoundly locked into their collective methodology that they barely spoke during the recording sessions. They played these incredibly complex, hour-long improvisations, communicating almost entirely through eye contact and physical intuition.
That is the sound of a collective neural network that has fully synchronized. The music had evolved beyond the need for spoken language in the studio, just as Demo Suzuki had moved beyond the need for literal language in the lyrics.
They had invented their own structural language from scratch, and in 2 years they had become entirely fluent in it.
It validates their entire initial thesis. These albums were not pretentious, self-indulgent art projects. They were rigorous, successfully verified scientific experiments.
Canon proved that you could make compelling, deeply moving, and even commercially viable music without utilizing a single structural rule from the Anglo-American rock blueprint.
You didn't need sheet music, you didn't need a narrative frontman, and you didn't need standard pop time signatures to make an audience feel something profound.
And because they approached music as a structural physics experiment rather than a stylistic trend, the findings from their laboratory ended up becoming the open source code for the next half-century of music.
Which brings us directly to their legacy and why this specific retrospective matters deeply to anyone listening to music right now.
Canana officially ceased operations as a core unit in 1979, but their methodology almost immediately infected the mainstream. You look at the post-punk and new wave movements of the late 70s and 80s. Bands like Public Image Ltd., Joy Division, or The Fall.
They were directly lifting the uncompromising repetition of the motoric beat and the stark, spatial, room-heavy production style that Suke pioneered.
but their influence goes so much further than rock music.
Think about the core principles we have been analyzing. The absolute, uncompromising reliance on mechanized repetition, the philosophy of treating the studio itself, the reverb, the spatiality as the primary instrument.
The conceptual breakthrough of taking raw recorded material, dropping it onto a grid, and using an editor to slice it, loop it, and recontextualize it into an entirely new composition.
These are not rock and roll concepts. These are the exact one-to-one foundational pillars of modern electronic dance music, of techno, of house, and of hip-hop production.
It is a direct lineage. When a hip-hop producer in the 1990s uses an Akai MPC sampler to chop up an old soul record, assigning different snare hits, when a techno DJ in Berlin locks a massive crowd into a sweaty 3-hour trance using nothing but a relentless, unchanging 44 kick drum and shifting synthesizer textures, they are directly invoking the neurological discoveries of Jaki Liebezeit.
Because their methods were rooted in the fundamental physics of sound and the psychology of human repetition, rather than the specific cultural fashion of the 1970s, their music is practically immune to aging.
You can put on H-Bomb Yassi today, and it sounds like it could have been recorded yesterday in a warehouse in Brooklyn. The structure is bulletproof.
And this structural immortality is why we are currently seeing a massive archival resurgence of their work. There are vast quantities of unreleased live tapes and studio outtakes currently being restored and published.
And these raw tapes are astonishing because they prove that the magic wasn't entirely a product of Holger Rusuke's razor blade.
When you hear these unedited, hour-long live improvisations, you realize that their ability to spontaneously generate complex architecture in real time was almost telepathic. The tape editing refined the genius, but the genius was genuinely present in the room.
I want to focus on a very specific distinction that often gets lost in music criticism. It is a massive cliche to say a band was ahead of their time.
Right.
But anticipating the future just means you correctly guessed what kind of haircuts or synthesizer tones would be popular in 10 years. You predicted a trend, but Can didn't just anticipate the future of music, they completely rewrote the definition of the medium.
That is the ultimate takeaway. Rewriting the definition means changing the process of how art is conceived. Before Can, the paradigm of the recording industry was a performance captured on tape. The goal was documentary.
By making the recording process itself, the acoustic reflections of the cinema, the capture of random radio waves, the physical splicing of time, the actual act of composition, Can shifted the entire paradigm to an auditory world constructed in a studio.
They didn't just guess what the 1990s would sound like. They invented the conceptual tools that made the 1990s possible.
We started this hour looking at the ashes of post-war Germany. We watched a volatile mix of avant-garde academics and jazz musicians reject the blueprints of their era to build a laboratory inside a movie theater.
They harnessed the physics of magnetic tape, the hypnotic neuroscience of an emotionless drum beat, the abstract textures of a street singer speaking in tongues, and the pure friction of chance.
They dismantled the ego-driven narrative of rock and roll, and from those scraps, they built the blueprint for the entire landscape of modern, loop-based music.
They proved that you do not need to follow the map if you are willing to lay down the tracks yourself as you barrel forward. They transformed the recording studio from a camera that takes pictures of sound into a synthesizer that creates entirely new realities.
And that leaves us with a final thought for you to carry with you.
Today, we live in an era of unprecedented convenience. Anyone can open a laptop, load up a digital audio workstation, and use software to generate endless, perfectly quantized, mathematically flawless loops in a matter of milliseconds.
The computer does instantly what Jaki Liebezeit and Holger 2K did by hand with razor blades and grueling, punishing physical endurance.
But the enduring magic of Can wasn't just the fact that they created a loop. The magic was in the human friction required to sustain it.
It was the singer pulled off the street screaming gibberish. It was the random burst of shortwave radio static bleeding through the drum microphones.
It was the beautiful, unpredictable human error operating inside the machinery. So the next time you are listening to a perfectly curated, algorithmically generated electronic playlist, ask yourself this. In our modern quest to engineer the absolute perfect digital structure, have we accidentally engineered out the beautiful, chaotic analog accidents that made those structures worth building in the first place?
A vital question for the future of how we interact with technology and art.
Keep your ears open and keep listening closely to the invisible architecture of the music around you.